On the line right now, I've got Dr. Kalev Sepp. Dr. Sepp is a senior lecturer in defense analysis at the U.S. Navy's postgraduate school out in Monterey. Long distinguished career both in the military and public service in the government. He's a former Army Special Operations officer, graduated from Harvard University, has his CIB, and served with the 82nd Airborne Division, 2nd Ranger Battalion. I think that speaks for itself, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. He's also taught at West Point. But what do you like? What do you like better, Kalev? Teaching in New York or teaching in Monterey, California? What's the better atmosphere?
You know, Matt, well, part of the difference is that at West Point you're teaching undergraduates, and out in California you're teaching. I get to teach graduate students, and so instead of young cadets, they're captains and majors, or lieutenants and lieutenant commanders in the case of the SEALs, from Army Special Forces, Air Force Special Operations, and then about a quarter of our students are international special operations. So it's a different flavor. You're talking about atmospherics, in the classroom. It's always terrific when you have these kind of dedicated students.
We're going to get to Korea in a minute, but after your considerable amount of work in the Baker Group and Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth, what do you see our progress in the Syrian conflict as being static, or is it getting better? I know it's probably a hard question to answer, but do you think there's progress being made? Because it's dropped off the media, it's dropped out of the news. I'm sure you've noticed that yourself, but that doesn't necessarily mean the fighting has stopped.
Yeah, Matt, I think you're exactly right. I don't think the issues that newsworthy items out of Syria fighting Daesh or the Islamic State has gone away. I think the media much of the media has decided to focus, on the president personally, and that just takes up the airtime. But all of the indicators that I have is that there's very strong progress being made because of the change in administration and the new Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis. Clarified.
Let me ask you this: do you see that as a real advantage for this president? Grant, he doesn't really have a lot of foreign policy experience or military experience, for that matter. Zip. Of course, neither did Obama, and neither did Clinton. Bush did to some degree. His father certainly did. Reagan didn't have a lot. But do you think that's a kind of a natural fit for him with Mattis and Kelly and the other military officers he's surrounded himself with?
I would point to something that Hoover Institute fellow, at Stanford University had pointed out, that in exactly what you're describing, that in President Trump's selection of these sort of personalities with their unbeatable range of experience, is that it's meant specifically to move some of the power of decision-making out of the White House to people that can be trusted to make very sound, very thoughtful decisions. And that, and I would include in that, in the list that you just read off, I'd include also Rex Tillerson, the head of, the former CEO of, a corporation, that is as large as he had to deal with, where all he does is deal with crises every single day. This is that. His role in the State Department is very helpful. So this is this movement of power outward, and to the president's benefit in the long term.
If he listens to him, and I think that's what's is on people's minds. Will he listen to their advice? And so far, it seems like he has. Let's change gears to North Korea and explain for people listening what are the different types of tactics and strategies, and we're not going to talk about. Well, we can talk about the diplomatic channels, but from trying to neuter North Korea ability to deliver atomic weapons or hydrogen weapons, around the world, what can be done short of cruise missile strikes, tactical nuclear strikes, that type of thing?
Oh, so you're saying short, short of military options, because in just the very clear-eyed view that any strategist has to approach this kind of problem with, which is what are all the things that could be done. You just very open-ended approach. We have the option to actually invade North Korea, and it's something that nobody wants to do. It would be a second Korean War. And it would not be an exaggeration to say, hundreds of thousands of people would die. The other one is one of the other options. Moving in that direction is moving away from that point would be surgical strikes. And all the difficulties that are attended to that. But then, to answer your question specifically, it's the military option is what would be called enhanced containment. It would, it's on the one hand, it's the most doable military option, and this is just the movement of for the United States, the movement of forces into the theater. The Navy bringing in guided missile cruisers, guided missile destroyers that carry the Aegis system, the anti-missile systems. The Air Force can move, fighter squadrons, bomber squadrons, supporting tanker squadrons forward, but very importantly, surveillance platforms. And then the Army can bring in the THAADs, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense missiles. Again, an anti-missile system. The South Korean government does not really want more U.S. troops on the ground, and that would be in part because they think it's would be provocative toward the North Koreans, more provocative than things already are. But also they have an extraordinarily powerful military force. They can defend their own country in that way.
If you have a wolf in a cage, I think your enhanced containment talks about putting another cage around the cage and limiting its activities and so forth. But does there come a point in time, Dr. Sepp, where that you've boxed that wolf in so much that he becomes even worse than he was before? And how do you know when to let your foot off the neck of something like that? Is it a day-to-day? Is it a week-to-week strategy? Because on the one hand, you do want to apply pressure, but on the other hand, you don't want to make that wolf look like he's got no way out, that he's never going to get out. So what has he got to lose?
Terrific question. This is the conundrum that I'll use the term, all the civilized nations are concerned with, to avoid, on the one hand, to avoid war, but on the other to contain this this very, very dangerous behavior on North Korea's part. But there's in a strategy and of its in and of itself, anytime you talk about strategy, it needs to be long term. As opposed to trying to deal with problems day to day. What do we want? And we don't want a war on the Korean Peninsula. How likely are the North Koreans, to turn your question about military options over? How likely would they be to try to invade South Korea? They, fundamentally, there are rational people around Kim Jong-un. They know that this is not possible. They couldn't succeed, and it would result in the complete destruction of their government and the ruling class.
When we come back after the break, thank you, Dr. Sepp. When we come back after the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about that regime change, from maybe an in to the out ways in the North Korean government, and cyber warfare as well. You're listening to News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. We'll be right back. And good morning. We're back on the Chad Hasty Show. My name's Matt Crow, substituting for Chad. He'll be back on Thursday. On the phone line from Monterey, California, Professor Kalev Sepp from the Navy's postgraduate school in Monterey. We've been talking about military options and tactics and strategies in dealing with North Korea. And one question I wanted to talk to you about, Dr. Sepp, how does the current leadership, Kim Jong-un, differ from somebody like Assad or Hussein, you name them, that they were able to, when I say they, through one way or another, with the exception of Assad, who's still going strong, it seems like. But, the Americans went into Iraq. Hussein was hung. The fellow over in Libya, his name escapes me.
Gaddafi.
Gaddafi. The squeeze was put to him, and finally, he was finished off. Is it the nature of the society of North Korea, as closed and as tight as it is, that do we have any hope of common sense among Kim Jong-un's military advisors coming to him and saying this is not going to work, we need to back off, or just doing away with them completely? Is there any chance of that?
This idea of regime change is constantly in discussion because and the illusion is that the removal of Muammar Gaddafi in particular appears, at least to some of the American audience, that that seemed to be fairly easy, didn't take very many not many casualties. And, talk about something that's out of the news. Libya is in flames. It's completely disrupted. It's just a region now, not governed. Different armed groups struggling violently for power in the country. China has one of the reasons that North Korea is so has been able to maintain its insular position is that China has helped maintain it as a buffer state against the advance from the south, from the Republic of Korea, and we've endorsed that over time. But so they have the North Koreans have a huge military base, about 1 million people serving in uniform at any time, possibly as many as 6 million reservists that they can call to active duty. Remembering that the entire U.S. Armed Forces right now is only like 1.4 million. But China doesn't want this sort of a war on its border and in this particular disruption to occur. So that's why military solutions, they're being presented. At some point, even military leaders realize there's a limit to what can be done, and then they turn their heads in the conference rooms toward the diplomats. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson at Secretary of State.
I was reading a little bit last couple of weeks about Munich in 1938 with Chamberlain and Hitler, and of course Hitler had annexed Austria back into Germany and the Third Reich, and then started looking at the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, and it seemed like the British and the French were willing to let Hitler have his head until finally he went into Poland, and that triggered the Second World War. Kim Jong-un isn't invading other countries. He's not gobbling up South Korea or Japan, but he is increasing its offensive capability. Is that reason enough for us to even entertain the thought of a preemptive strike on their nuclear R&D facilities? I mean, if he's not invading anywhere, and he's just content to develop, nuclear weapons with delivery capability, is that enough to trigger a hard response from the United States or any other country for that matter?
Matt, you're hitting on a tremendous strategic insight right now, and it's the point is that is this an offensive capability that would support North Korea in exactly the way that you're talking about? The only direction they have to go, obviously, is to again, speaking in theoretical terms, would be to invade the South, as they have pounded their fists on the tables and said that they were for decades. They're going to reunify Korea. They fundamentally, the realists know that can't be done. So what is the nuclear weapon for? Is it really an offensive weapon? And nuclear strategists have been looking at this since the beginning of the the Cold War, excuse me. And it's one of the ways to think about that weapon. And I'm not speaking in admiration of North Korea here, but is that it's actually a deterrent weapon. It's a protection against an invasion from South Korea or any other country that decides that there needs to be regime change, or the North Korean government needs to be swept away. This was one of the outcomes. You might, since you're very well read on these subjects, recall one of the outcomes from the 1991 Gulf War. The liberation of Kuwait. The Indian General Staff reviewing the war from their perspective from South Asia was the chief lesson of the war is never go to war to the United States unless you have nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And so this is part of what the North Koreans certainly have in mind. Is just there is a deterrent attack against them.
I wanted to ask you real quick, do you have to get off the air right away, or could you stay for another 15 minutes?
Matt, I'll stay for another 15 if I can be at all helpful to you.
That would be perfect. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of North and South Korea, why the United States went to war there in the first place, and possibly the way China could react if there was a war. You're listening to and also just before we get to that point, I want to talk to you too about intelligence when we come back. Was there an intelligence breakdown on the development of the North Koreans with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles? Did the CIA fail us? And if they have failed us, what can we do to get back ahead of ourselves in North Korea, even if we can get ahead of ourselves in North Korea, to know what's coming? So I'll be interested to hear you say that. And real quick, just from a housekeeping perspective, Dr. Sepp, how many students roughly do you have at the postgraduate school right now?
Oh my gosh! Let's see. We have about 1,200 students in all the departments. About half of them are science and technology departments, mm-hmm. and the others are in foreign area officer training, and
gotcha.
For attachés, and also in our special operations program, which is actually the largest single department in terms of students on the campus.
Great. We'll be back in a few minutes with Dr. Kalev Sepp from the Naval Postgraduate School. You're listening to KFYO. And good morning. You're back on the Chad Hasty Show on Newstalk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. My name is Matt Crow, and on the line from Monterey, California is Dr. Kalev Sepp from the Navy's Postgraduate School. Yeah, Dr. Sepp, I was going to, before the break, I was talking about intelligence failures. Reminiscent, and I know you're an expert in military history, but back in the Korean War, number one, the CIA didn't see North Korea invading South Korea. And number two, the CIA didn't see the Chinese coming into the war. There were absolutely no warnings on either of those points. And my question is this. Is there a problem at CIA in the respect that, number one, all of a sudden the North Koreans are developing ballistic missiles? Number two, now they're developing nuclear weapons. Number three, now they're developing miniaturized warheads to put on those ballistic missiles. And number four, guess what? Now they've developed evidently a hydrogen bomb. And if the pictures are to be believed, miniaturized enough that they can put that on top of a ballistic missile. It seemed to me that the CIA did a really good job with Iran, and then we put the screws to Iran to stop their nuclear development program. Why hasn't that happened in North Korea?
Matt, let me without me sounding like I'm defending the CIA. There's right now. I would tell you just because you were asking about our school. In our department, we have a chair of national intelligence who's a Central Intelligence Agency, clandestine service officer that teaches classes, has access to our students, for all the intelligence classes that they need. and they're very well steeped in the things that the CIA has done right and done wrong over time. But the tracking of the development of the missile capability and the nuclear capability of the North Koreans has been there hasn't been surprises. This has been there's always been an awareness that this program has been underway. It's the issue is the being blinded to it by the North Koreans themselves. It's simply called denial, or operational security. But a lot of the claims that the North Korean, the bragging and the boasting that Kim Jong-un and the North Korean leadership make about their capabilities, actually that gets disassembled by very good CIA analysis. Like you were just mentioning, the miniaturization that the North Koreans are claiming. There's some doubt that that's actually within their capabilities at this time.
What about Iran, though, Dr. Sepp? It seems to me that is there not a corollary between what we were able to do by putting the screws to the Iranians to stop versus getting the North Koreans to stop? Two completely different atmospheres we're talking about. Very different levels of concern, and in terms of in the regions, in Southwest Asia or the Middle East, Israel's excellent intelligence services are very closely focused on Iran for the issue of their national survival, and so there's a lot of intelligence sharing that has gone on there that lends itself to had lent itself to a clearer picture of the Iranian capabilities. What's your forecast for the next 6 or 7 months? How do you see this rounding out?
I'm sorry, my crystal ball's a little foggy this morning. What it looks like, the direction that things are going is that there'll be because there's a coming together of the United Nations Security Council on what to do in terms of sanctions, increasing the sanctions, and possibly some of those sanctions being applied against China, which is very interesting. President Putin of Russia has announced that while he thinks that the North Korean missile tests are provocative, then on the other hand, he says that sanctions achieve nothing. Well, I would just point out, of course he'll say they achieve nothing because he's under sanctions right now. He would claim that they're not doing anything to Russia. Where we've imposed sanctions, the West has imposed sanctions over Russian activity and having seized Crimea and supporting an armed insurgency in the Ukraine.
I was going to say it's a sticky wicket for the Chinese, and of course it is for the Russians as well. And they don't want to see things go down the drain in North Korea with the United States. But what do you, as far as the Chinese are concerned? I mean, they have a huge stake in our economy, and to some degree they have a stake in the South Korean economy. What they have a stake in with the North Koreans is they don't want a huge influx of refugees from North Korea going into China if war did start, or there was some kind of a be all end all confrontation. But do you see the Chinese finally coming to the North Koreans and saying, look, this is not going to work out to your benefit, and we've got huge investments in the United States? Would the North Koreans even react to that? Or I guess what I'm asking is, are the Chinese capable of turning the screws a little tighter on the North Koreans where they back off? Because it seems like at this point they're going to continue to develop their ballistic missile systems and their nuclear weapons. So I think unfortunately that horse has left the gate. But we've also taken our tactical nukes out of South Korea. So, I mean, if indeed the Chinese can do something, will it be decisive, or will it just kind of fall on deaf ears?
if there's anything that again, based on excellent intelligence reports that we do have, and and what our analysts are able to surmise, is that if when the Chinese want to do something or make the North Koreans do something, it's never made public, and for a number of reasons. But some of that's just Chinese diplomatic culture. Is to keep these sort of moves hidden, but the other is that fundamentally what do the Chinese want? Do they want to have a Republic of Korea, a unified however it's done by war, by negotiation, a Western oriented Republic of Korea directly on their border? And at this point, they don't want that. They'd rather maintain North Korea as a client state, and then try to manage it in some way. But there's already indications over the past year that the Chinese, who were once openly very supportive of the North Koreans, that's begun to taper off very significantly. And so there's some indication that all these other pressures and North Korea's own very erratic actions are beginning to take hold on the part of the Chinese.
Well, and I felt with that one test that the North Koreans launched that sailed over the northern part of Japan. I don't know. It's a hard read. You're in the business, and you know a lot more about this than I do. But at some point, I would guess that the Japanese and even the Malaysians and Australians and the Filipinos would start to say, what's going on out here? I mean, we've got our tail feathers hanging out in the breeze, and it doesn't seem like anything's happening. I mean, how does Tillerson and the DefSec, explain to these countries you're going to be all right? We've got it under control.
It's the statement that Secretary of Defense Mattis made yesterday after his meeting with President Trump was immediately the most significant and the most assuring. He talked about our alliance with both the Republic of Korea and Japan, and he called them direct in a very brief statement, which gave it all the more impact when he did this. He called them ironclad alliances. That by itself means that if North Korea tries to make any sort of military aggression against those two countries, the United States is going to be with them, is going to respond. So that's very positive.
Well, and I guess it'll remain to be seen exactly going forward how the Chinese can help us turn the screws back down on the North Koreans. I for one, I would pray that the military clique around Kim Jong-un might somehow get to him, and see the light of day. That unless they're convinced that they can carry on for the next 30 or 40 years, as long as some of these generals can live and maintain their standard of living, of course, which is better than the average population of North Korea, who have next to nothing. It's going to be just kind of a self-perpetrating dynamic over there that nothing ever changes, and everyone's on a kind of a hair trigger. It's a sad commentary, but I guess if we could live with a Cold War as long as we did, we can live with this.
Matt, you've hit on it just perfectly here. And because you know history so well, point back to Eisenhower, to President Eisenhower when he was in office, and on the Russians on the one hand were blustering about they're developing a nuclear arsenal and talking about ensuring that the red flag of revolution and communism will wave over the world. And as President Eisenhower was want to say, he says, I know all of those people, and he did. He'd met all of their military leadership during the war, and a lot of the people that became the political leadership. And he said that they're most interested in just maintaining power, and they're not going to fall on their own sword, sacrifice themselves for some imagined ideological goal. which is something, we see that in extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. But the North Koreans are just, in most analyses, the North Koreans can be seen as being like the Russians during the Cold War. A lot of talk about how important the Korean Juche is, self-reliance, the purity of the Korean race. It's very racist, interestingly. But in the way that you described, of the North Korean population, the upper quarter is this privileged elite, and there's a middle two quarters, sort of middle half, that are impoverished, but provide the functioning provide the functioning economy. And about a quarter, frankly, are in slave labor camps that are considered politically unreliable. But to upset any of that, would the leadership, throw their power away? No,
not going to happen.
It doesn't look like they would take that.
Yeah. You've been listening to Dr. Kalev Sepp, a professor at the Navy's postgraduate school in Monterey. Dr. Sepp, thank you as always. Sure appreciate it. And I hope down the road we can have you back on as things develop overseas. And tell your students we're proud of them, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Matt, and my best to all your listeners out in Lubbock.
All right, you're listening to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO.